Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2019 Marshall State of the Agriculture Panel. For those who do not know me, I'm Greg Ruhat. I'm the president here at Marshall Chamber of Commerce. Appreciate you all coming today. Before we introduce our panelists, we have many sponsors that I'd like to thank to help put today's event on. First off, if you hear your business name, just a quick wave will do. First off, our series sponsors, Bremer Bank. Raise your hand if you're in the room representing Bremer Bank. And Titan Machinery. Thank you to our two series sponsors. Also, we have several event sponsors today. First Independent Bank, Northwestern Farm Management, AURI, Ralco, Hennon Seeds, Vanderhagen Skogren and Associates, and Ace Hardware. Thank you all again once for sponsoring. Please give them a nice round of applause. This is our second year holding this panel, and why is this important? Agriculture is truly the lifeblood of a community like Marshall. When agriculture does well, the economy does better. It's important for ag-related businesses and business in general to hear from panelists that come from different ag backgrounds like we have here today. So let's meet our panelists. First, we have Chad Drake. Chad is the market president at Bremer and also helps farm on the county farm. Next, we have Greg Boerboom. Greg, along with his family, are owners of Boerboom Ag Resources, which is the name of a family farming operation which raises hogs, corn, soybeans, and does feed milling. Greg serves as the president of Minnesota Pork Producers Association, which oversees state and national legislative and public policy interests, traveling to both St. Paul and Washington, D.C. on behalf of Minnesota pork producers. Greg is also a member of the Lyon County Farm Bureau Board of Directors. Next, we have Joel Wiering, who is the CHS Brandon Regional Grain Procurement Manager. Joel farms on the side of his dad, producing corn and soybeans. And our fourth panelist is Representative Chris Swedzinski. Chris is a farmer, small business owner, and local street representative for District 16A. He sits on the Energy and Climate, Finance and Policy Division, and Commerce and Tax Committees. Thank you all once again for sitting on the panel. So last week I asked for questions ahead of time, and many of you sent me some questions. I hope to get up to all of them. And keep in mind, panelists, not each question that I ask might be a fit for all of you, all four of you. Sometimes it can be redundant if everybody does choose to answer, but feel free to answer as you wish. So let's kick it off with our first question. Again, thanks to everybody for being here and submitting some questions ahead of time. Chad is our first question. You ready?
I don't know, is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
I guess I'm ready.
Okay. Chad, what if, and then again, the first one's directed towards Chad, but if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free. What effect will prevent plant acres have on cash flows this year and going into next? What effect will prevent plant acres have on cash flows this year and going into next?
Yeah, so I guess I just act like a politician here to ride the fence on this answer, but you know, we've seen certainly each individual operation is different. So you know, we have some people who actually seem to have benefited from preventive plant. You know, there's some information that came out with the market facilitation program. It seemed that early on that wasn't going to be supported if you did plant. Now that that's part of, if you put some cover crop on it, that is part of the payment. I think those that had high numbers of corn acres, we've seen them probably be able to weather the storm a little bit more than soybean acres, but with the soybean acres probably weren't looking so promising to start anyway. So one thing that we're kind of guiding producers with is they're coming upon a large amount of cash right now. Many times in their operation they're carrying obviously the cost of the inputs throughout the growing season. They're actually maybe selling last year's grain, and so now at this point they're liquidating last year's grain. They're getting their preventive plant check. They're sitting with a lot more cash, but doesn't necessarily equate to them having great cash flow. And so just some education of a time that's different than a lot of people have experienced at this time. But in general, it looks like cash flows stay relatively intact. may have some issues with irrigating that stand and covering them types of things. Maybe they have too much of their operation in the plant.
Anyone else?
Yeah, they're directed at one person, but I thought about this a lot.
Yep.
I think something in Chad referred to it, and I think it should really be emphasized. People are going to get checks from Prevent Plant here real soon, or maybe they already have them. And then when they typically be selling their crop, like next January, February, March, April, they aren't going to have the cash flow, and then they're going to have the input expenses for next year's crop. And so I really believe that next February, March, April, you're going to really see a cash flow crunch in ag, especially in crop production.
Chris?
I just kind of think, I was visiting with some truckers a couple weeks back, and really from just a volume standpoint, from a shipping portion, what we talk about the Prevent Plant and the acres and the finance, but also just what's going to be from the oscillator businesses and how they're going to be affected. And I know a few firms are out there that are really concerned about, just physically, what are they going to move? What are they going to do to keep their trucks rolling and the rest? And so it's not just going to be the acres involved, but it's how many bushels are going to be needing to be moved this fall. And then, a lot of the loads are both ways. They'll haul soybeans to Mankato, and then they'll take meal to St. Paul, and then take fertilizer back here. And so that whole, obviously some stocks are going to be up, but, just those are the things that we need to be kind of conscious of, and I hope I didn't answer a question that's coming. So.
No problem. Since we skipped over Joel, we'll have Joel take on this one. Joel, what is it going to take? What is it going to take to get basis levels on beans to shrink up?
The biggest factor right now is the trade war currently going on with China, and that's the overwhelming black cloud to not only the soybean market, but as well as local demand you're seeing on the basis side here. And honestly, until we get some sort of trade agreement done with China, basis is going to remain defensive locally. So to put it in perspective, my regional that I procure grain for, normally we export 50 to 60% of our beans, and that all goes to the Pacific Northwest, the PNW, on a boat, in the last 5 years mainly to China. This year we exported 15% of our beans. In this upcoming year I expect that to be less. So bushel amounts, that's 3.5 to 4.5 million bushels of beans that stayed locally. And they're going to one of the processors, whether it be in Mankato, Brewster, or South Dakota, or even south of the Sioux Center market, or Sioux City market, excuse me. So when that many beans have to stay local, basis is going to remain under pressure. And I don't see it getting better until we see some sort of trade agreement. And yeah, this week they've talked about seeing some of the private firms in China have the ability to buy some beans from the U.S. tariff-free per se. Realistically, 2 to 6 million metric tons of beans. It doesn't really even turn the dial. North Dakota will cover all those beans, and it won't affect any of the beans here. So that's the biggest thing that we need to see in order for our basis levels locally to get better.
Sure, I'll just speak to that. I think portions of that is, not only the trade issues internationally, but just there is we have a lot of grain out there. You look at what's old stocks, new stocks, and what's potentially going to be there. At the end of the day, the long-term goal. So your short-term goal is obviously end any issues you have when it comes to trade. The long-term goal is how do you add value here? So just as we said, right here, our what we're doing with the grain, what are we doing to add value to it? Are we turning it into diesel fuel? Are we turning it into meal and exporting it? What are we going to do? Are we going to put it into an animal, create a protein and then sell it? Boerboom's doing an excellent job of running that gamut up the value chain. We had a great opportunity that we whipped as a state of Minnesota when it came to true shrimp. They're integrating a lot of different products that we grow here in Southwest Minnesota. And what we do when it comes to getting that next plant or crushers, I know South Dakota just opened up a $300 million project, I think it's in Mitchell, for a soybean crusher. And what that does to the local basis, that's what they're seeking out right now when they're coming to large processing is where is that gap the widest between the market and paper and versus what it is on the ground. And they're trying to, if they're going to develop a project, that's where it's going to go. And so We have blessings such as Brewster and the rest in southwest Minnesota, but we need to be expediting from a management standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, that we're a friendly place to put that in. So you have the short term and the long term, and that's the part that the state should play, as being a friendly place for those projects, whether it be animal agriculture, food processing, or grain marketing. All the rest need to happen here in southwest Minnesota, so it affects people right here.
Yeah, just, you make a good point to short-term versus long-term. Long-term, yeah, the trade agreement, or short-term trade agreement is great. Long-term, we gave China the last year to figure out a way how to not buy U.S. soybeans, and they figured it out. So even, I talk about turning the dial, even China coming back on with their business, they're not going to have to buy and source as many U.S. soybeans as they've done in the past, because we told them to buy from somebody else and they did. So it's going to take a long time to build that business back up to where it was, especially with the African swine flu and the effects on their hogs in China. So we need to find some of these local, domestic alternatives for us.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Well, speaking of China, let's talk about that a little bit. There's a couple of questions on here regarding tariffs in China. Greg, with prolonged tariffs and trade disputes now going on for over a year, what do you think the likelihood that these disputes have changed the way global trade is conducted permanently?
So I think on the pork side, it's probably changed permanently for a couple of reasons. One, it was just kind of alluded to within soybeans. I think China's finding a new spot to buy pork. They're buying a lot of pork right now from the European Union. I think that's up 34% so far this year from previous purchases. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to be in Chile, and I was talking to the guy in Chile that'd be in charge of their international sales, and kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he was thanking me, or thanking the U.S. for bringing pork to Chile to backfill their local pork supply, because they're sending so much of their pork to China at a higher margin than they would sell it in their own stores. So we're providing Chile the cheap pork, and then they're making a higher margin selling it to China. So I think all those trade routes or trade avenues are being established with other countries, and so I think it'll be hard for the U.S. to get back into the China market, or get into the China market once the trade war has ended and the tariffs have been lifted. It'll be a long process after that, so yeah, I think there's permanent change.
Anyone else? Okay. Let's expand on that one more time. It was mentioned the swine fever was just talked about. So, Greg, how has the African swine fever in China impacted the U.S., and what would happen if it ever came to the U.S.?
Yeah, two totally different situations. So first, it's impacted China. It's been huge. If you get a group of pork producers together at a meeting such as like this would be, I mean, the number one topic among everyone and number one concern both in U.S. and Canada would be ASF. ASF coming on both sides. First, the opportunity for us to sell pork there, 50%. So China doesn't have very good statistical records on agriculture, and if they do have them, they don't release them. I mean, they just keep them to themselves. So the rumor and the story, anywhere from 20 to 50% of China's pig population is gone, and most of the economists that are talking now are talking closer to the 50%. And so to put that in perspective, China raises as many pigs, China raises twice as many pigs as pretty much anywhere in the world. They've lost, 50% of their pig population is gone. That would be a quarter of the world pig production. So, and they've lost what is in the US and Canada combined. So that's a huge void that would need to be filled. And so the opportunity from pricing and the emotions got away with the Chicago Board of Trade, and between March and April, the market, the futures raced straight up for a month, like every day they just raced up unbelievable levels. And then kind of reality came into play, and the markets dropped back down to previous, the same levels that were last winter. But so the opportunity is there. The risks are just like here. There's a certain amount of the population in China are now afraid to eat pork because they're concerned about ASF, which is not transmissible to people, but just like you have some concerns. They've also lost some market share to poultry. Some of the pig barns in China have been refilled with chickens, And so then some of that opportunity has been gone. But it's still running rampant, and it's jumped over into Vietnam, into Laos, Cambodia, some of the other Asian countries, which are large swine producers and large pork consumers. So it really impacts us as a great opportunity. The last part of that question, if it would come to the U.S., that's the biggest concern when you get U.S. and Canadian pork producers together, is they talk about what if it comes here, and some say when it comes here. 26% of our pork is exported, which means ASF is considered with ASF, exports are halted immediately. So I read something this morning, if ASF hit the U.S., pigs would drop about $40 to $50 a head within 5 days, because we'd have 25% excess pork on our market immediately. So that's a huge concern. As an organization, pork producers are lobbying heavily to increase the surveillance, especially at the international airports, with inadvertent passengers just bringing in meat supplies, just like as simple as a salmon, ham sandwich in a backpack, or trying to smuggle in some meat products because it's a cultural thing that they want to have at a celebration at a cell or something. So that is like the #1 topic amongst pork producers today.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so I have 9 questions on my sheet of paper. Therefore, I'm going to ask that anybody that has some follow-up questions or anybody that has any questions in general, feel free to raise your hand and we'll pass over the mic to make sure that the Studio 1 can hear you first off, but secondly, so that everybody can hear you. So, does anybody have any follow-up questions thus far? Okay.
Sorry, I do have a follow-up question. So with the African swine flu, like when is it gonna come? What are your thoughts or experience with confinement barn hogs, where it's confinement barn hogs as opposed to non-confinement barn hogs? Like, do you think the immunity would be different, or if it comes, it's gonna wipe, or when it comes, it's gonna take them all out, regardless if they're confinement hog barns or not? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The biggest risk in Europe, African swine fever is in Europe, in Belgium, a couple of the other countries. The biggest spread, it was spread there with wild pigs. So it's not quite like your, the outdoor pigs you're thinking of. But the biggest risk in Europe is the wild boar population, which is just the wild pigs. And those are the pigs that are spreading it throughout the Europe. And it came into Belgium because somebody illegally smuggled in some wild pigs to release on a game preserve farm for hunting purposes. Those pigs had African swine fever, and then they spread it to other wild pigs. It never did get into the domestic pig supply. And so the risk here that Minnesota, or nationally, they've set up a task force to research all the ways to end African swine fever. One of the subcommittees that this is just being set up, the committee structure was just released today, but I'll be on the wild boar and wild pig spreading subcommittee, whatever the exact title is, I can't think right now. So wild pigs, wild boars are a major concern. And then within the domestic pig population, obviously the immunity level would be the same on both outdoor pigs and indoor pigs. The outdoor pigs would be at a bigger risk because they may become exposed to, if you're driving down the highways. We talk about meat because African swine fever will live in meat for a long time, like years. And so if it'll even survive a processing, like sausage processing mechanism. So that's why we talk about meat sandwiches or that spreading vector. So if you throw your sandwich out the window, or you bring it home from, and this actually happened to an individual. His daughter came home from Germany. When he got to this guy's pig farm, she took out her backpack and she had a stale ham sandwich that she had brought along to eat, and didn't eat it. So she was just going to just go throw this to the dog or throw it to the pigs or whatever you're going to. In her case, it's going to be the dog. And he was like, oh, no, you don't do. And so that's a big risk that can happen. So the outdoor pigs, I'd say, are a bigger risk because they have more opportunity to access what might spread it to them.
Chris?
I just think, the closest relation that we have to, what it could potentially mean in swine is what we dealt with the bird flu that we dealt with in the turkey population here locally and everywhere. And that's kind of the same route where it was an outside influence, an outside carrier, wild ducks or whatever flying over, and that's what they estimate that, so it's, what are you setting up from a reactionary force, from a veterinary medicine standpoint? The state of Minnesota, as I would say, is exceptionally good on the reactionary point. How do we deal with this problem internally here in the state? How do we quarantine and the rest? And from a disease management, I think the biggest part that they hit is what's going on in China too, is if it does come, it's not only a loss of the market because you close your borders, but it's also going to be a loss of consumption. And so you're just going to have that many less people choosing the other white meat as a protein option. And so, that's the important thing you're looking at from a trade route. Why is it so important that we have animal agriculture here in a strong point, strong trade, is that we export, we do not import. It would be a different story if we imported 15 or 20% of our hog production. I think there was just a story a month and a half ago where they came across a large shipment of pork product in one of the shipping containers from, I think it was from the Asian someplace or another. And so, it's not like folks are not trying to send things here. And obviously, whether it be eco-terrorists or the rest, whether they're trying to videotape you hitting a pig on the head with a pipe, or bring something nasty like that into the country. I mean, you could drastically reduce the amount of hogs you have in confinement farms, and that it's in reality, it's modern agriculture, and those animals are much better and much healthier because of that. So,
Any other follow-up questions on that? Thanks, Scott. Okay. All right, next question. And this can be for anyone, it could be all four of you. How is regulation affecting agriculture and development of agribusiness in the state of Minnesota?
Well, since I have the mic, I could start. I think, to some extent, we're in a battle. We have a local business that was potentially going to be expanding and growing here in southwest Minnesota because of the state and what we do and what we ask for. We're losing that battle. But when we're trying to add value to agriculture by processing and making and turning things into a final product, like true shrimp, that's one very good example. We need to be competitive, and we need to get state agencies under control. Folks that live awfully far away from farms and don't understand how they work and how local economies work are probably the wrong people to have in charge of how we do business. And there needs to be a real common sense and kind of a coming together. And it'd be my real hope that it was my hope that this next administration would make some good strides and really kind of bring some common sense. And I think that's left to be seen yet. But when a permit process, I mean, we have water permits in grain processing that, especially the ethanol industry, that are 10 years out of date. So they're waiting on a water permit for 10 years from the state of Minnesota. So when you're talking to your banker and you're saying, hey, would you give me a loan for this process so that I can build this building and create this business? How does that conversation go? When you say, well, I've got a permit that's up for 10 years that I'm not sure if it doesn't get renewed or someone decides they don't like me anymore, I'm out of business. Well, if you're from a finance standpoint, you look at the reality of the situation. And just if we're trying to grow jobs, I mean, people don't just have cash. You have to go out and get loans, and we have smart guys that are behind pushing pencils that are going to make that call. And they're going to say, well, I don't think it's the right place for you. I think your business model works. I think what you're going to do is going to be a good idea, and it's going to create jobs. It's going to create people to live in our communities, but I just think you're doing it in the wrong place. And so, if we're going to be competitive, we have to get our state agencies under control. And I firmly believe we can have clean water, we can have clean air, but we also can have some great innovative businesses grow here in Minnesota. And I think it's a tremendous, it's probably one of the biggest obstacles besides taxation I think we have when it comes to business here. And yeah.
No, I agree. There certainly feels like there's a disconnect between the country, the rural ag sector, than than there needs to be. Now, there's good things about having some of these regulatory processes in place, and there's certainly a good checkpoint for us. If you look at, we alluded to the bird flu. I mean, some of those things that we have in place as far as our feed side, we need and will continue to need, so we don't have a catastrophe, whether it's the bird flu or the African swine fever. Don't get me wrong, but there certainly needs to be more common ground between the two, because what we find when some of these regulatory things come down to us is we don't understand because they don't make sense to us, because it's just political jargon, as I'll call it, and it's very tough for us to run our businesses, and it's going to continue to be tough, but I do think we need those processes in place. It's just more common ground between the two groups.
Yeah, a little bit of a side on that, a little bit different perspective. All the regulatory and regulations that we deal with today have changed the way we do business, and I think they've changed it permanently. And part of that is acceptance. In the past, if we were going to build, and I use the hog barn as an example because that's our business, we just did it. You know, you went and you found a spot and you built a barn, and very few questions asked, and you did it right. And if you did it right, you wouldn't have any problems. Today, you have a lot of regulations in place, so the permitting process will take, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, or if it's a little bit of a larger barn, it'll take up to a year if it has enough animal units. And that, I think, has been accepted. So the people doing it today, rather than fight some of these regulations like we would have in the past, they just start with the process, check the boxes, go through the process, plan 6 months or a year ahead. If you think you're going to build something next summer, you'll start the process already early this summer. So I think that's been accepted by the next generation of producers. So I think that regulations have permanently changed the way we do business. And then the next step is to what Chris alluded to, is now it's time to make, so a big concern, especially like Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, most of the new hires there, most of the staff people have no experience in agriculture at all. So they only know what they've read in the book and what they've learned out of a book. So when they see a livestock production facility, they have to be educated to what they're looking at before they can even regulate it, or before they can even make a judgment on a ruling. And so that's probably the inexperience of the people in those agencies. The inexperience in agriculture is probably the biggest thing we face, especially in MPCA.
I don't really have a ton of stuff to add when it comes to regulation, but specific to the banking industry, I think it's, you talk about some of the changes and the permanent changes, and just the way that it's now accepted to do business. People used to get loans on a handshake or a little posted card type of thing, and now you sign 100 pages just to get $100,000, and that's mostly due to compliance and regulation, things of that nature. So a lot of that obviously came out of the financial crisis that happened in 2008. And of course, when you have a crisis like that, the pendulum swings just way too far to one side or the other. And so it seems to be somewhat coming back. But there's been some permanent changes, the way banks have to handle problem credits. There's a lot of very, very good producers, very solid producers. A huge misconception in banking is a problem credit can be somebody with a significant amount of equity, and people. There's many consumers of products who don't understand that concept, and our ability to maintain that relationship for an extended period of time is different than it was 10, 15 years ago. So that creates issues for the banks, for the producers. And just the sheer ability to obtain credit with some of the regulations. It may not directly impact you, but just at Bremer, we've had to hire so many compliance people, or people who support compliance, to fill out all these government reports that are due, or else we're not in good standing with the OCC, which is obviously a huge no-no in the banking industry. So. Every compliance person you hire is one less person that can be out servicing your clients. working through cash flows, talking about some of the issues that are impacting them directly. So it may not be direct, but it does happen.
Good question. I did a couple of business visits here in the last couple of weeks, and part of my visits is what are your public policy concerns? And regulations and compliance are two of certainly, as Chris mentioned, a big factor when it tries to do good business in town. So thanks for your answers. Any follow-up questions regarding compliance regulations? Okay. All right. Next question. Let's see. Greg, how likely do you think it is that the hog industry will see another expansion in sow numbers now since we have, oh my gosh, this is, let me start over. How likely do you think it is that the hog industry will see another expansion in sow numbers now since we have some better prices in the last few months? That make sense? Okay.
Yeah, it's a long question. I could say not likely. I saw the question ahead of time, so the interesting thing is the prices aren't that special right now, so I don't think there's a lot of talk or a lot of expansion ideas going on. And a big part of that is the uncertainty over the risk of ASF and also with the tariffs and the risk of trade. As far as prices, on March 8th, they're very, very low. I jotted these down because I did see that question ahead of time. March 8th, they were really, really low. They raced straight up between March 8th and March 22nd, probably went up about 30–40%. And then starting on March 22nd, or between March 22nd, March 8th to 22nd, they went straight up. Between March 22nd and April 23rd, in that month, they dropped straight back down as fast as they went up. And then now they've just been kind of a slow, steady incline in pricing, or just kind of a normal flow in pricing. So to answer your question, most hog projects, because the end of that question says because of the prices right now, kind of like I answered on the regulatory issue, most sow projects are planned up to 1 and 2 years prior to when they're built. And so you see a lot of them that get cleared to the permitting stage or even are permitted. And then if prices aren't quite there or the situation is as uncertain as it is now, then they pull the plug and don't do the building project. So a lot of rumors you hear about projects being built when it comes time to do it. Actually, they're not. Talking to one rafter company representative recently, he's had a lot of cancellations for rafter orders for barns that aren't going to be built because the prices went down.
Anyone else? Any follow-up questions on that?
Just a quick question. I'm a commissioner here in Lyon County. Cost of production. Do you think that's is stopping people from expanding now because of the shortage of corn that's going to be in this area? And I just wonder how that's going to affect the other livestock producers.
Gary, I think short term, probably not. We're concerned about corn prices. We're kind of on the fringe area for we can talk about it. We talked about it before we met as far as from the grain procurement for commercial elevators. For our own farm, south and west of us in Marshall, there's really going to be very little corn. The corn supply is going to be way, way short. If we get north of here and east of here, the crop looks pretty decent. So we're concerned about the corn availability and corn quality more so, but I don't think anyone is not expanding because the expansion would be a long-term. But that will raise the cost of production. The cost of feed definitely will. $4 or so or less for corn, you can manage that in pig production. And that's kind of a level that the crop guys need too. So that's a nice manageable level. So, we don't need that craziness we had a few years ago of, the 6, 7, 8 type of deal. But if it's at 4, I don't think that's going to impact. It'll impact profitability, but it isn't going to decimate the pig industry. A bigger deal on the cost of production, or it'd be on expansion and building, is the cost of construction. I think I'm aware of an individual that they're going to not build a project because once they start getting bids in and seeing what the project was really going to cost, they decided not to do it.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you. All right, this is for anyone. With the rapid deployment of solar technology in Minnesota, what will its effect be on agriculture and access to land?
I mean, it's certainly going to take some acres away from agriculture, but as we continue to grow and progress with our technology, our own seed technology, I think it will be a pretty offsetting effect. I don't think it's going to totally offset or take away many acres in production, because we're going to continue to grow. So I don't see it having a large effect, and it will have a positive effect moving forward. The sustainable energy.
I think, from a certain extent, if you look at what's population growth, they estimate, population is going to double again here in 50 years or at 2050 or something like that. So we're just going to have a lot more mouths to feed. How we go about doing that, whether it's traditional agriculture, corn, wheat, beans, alfalfa, whatever that might be. It should be, I think, a decent concern. I think I would say it's not just solar, but it's, whether it be, just land being taken out of production in general through like the state legacy dollars and the rest, or solar projects. Wind I don't think really takes up that much property just because it's more of a gravel road to whatever. But I mean, I think I heard a report a while back talking about XL Energy, just their projects alone were going to be about 22,000 acres of land, plus all the others potentially with the community solar and the rest. I mean, we're talking, I think if the state of Minnesota went forward with the clean 100% renewable by 2050, which was Governor Walz's what he ran on, I mean, we'd be potentially talking about hundreds of thousands of acres of land that would be taken out of production. So, for just to kind of give a rough estimate, for every 1 megawatt of solar production is about 7 acres of ground. So, on that average, in that last major heat wave that we had, I think we got about maybe 3% or 1% or less from solar. So if your goal is to move it above and beyond that to say 20-25%, and say use say 200 megawatts or 200,000 megawatts of power, and you do the math, that's your goal. I mean, that's what it's going to do. And so while it would directly benefit potentially the landowner or the leasee or however that arrangement is, it would definitely help them. But if you're looking at bringing in that next generation of agriculture, they say that on average that the next farmer is 55 years of age or older here in Southwest Minnesota. If your goal is to bring the next generation into an actual active farm and have people live in Southwest Minnesota, because guess what? If you want to have a school that's healthy, you got to have young kids. You got to have people that are going to grow up and grocery shop and the rest. If you're just a land investor, you're probably not going to live in Southwest Minnesota. You're going to be living in Arizona or a different tax type state. So, those should be concerns and in what direction it is. So if it's about clean energy, then it probably should be wind. If it's about the politics of energy, then it's probably about solar.
Yeah, I think with solar, location is critical. I think non-irrigated farmland should not be given up for solar installations, because we'll need food more than we'll need electricity with population growth and just moving forward. So I think solar as a clean energy supply is great, but it should be located on, because you take out an acre of irrigated or non-irrigated, southern Minnesota or Iowa or wherever, non-irrigated cropland, then you've either got to clear some native vegetation from somewhere in the world to produce that same food, or irrigate land, and a lot of the irrigation is coming out of your wells or a water source that is also at jeopardy. So I think they got to be located in the right spots, and like I said, non-irrigated farmland is not the spot for it.
Anyone else? Any follow-up questions? Okay. Thank you. Next Next question is for Joel. Joel, will we see a positive basis in corn in the next 12 months? And then in parentheses,
Yes.
it says at a regular elevator, not your ethanol plants.
Yeah, we certainly will, especially in this area. Greg alluded to that. You know, $4 corn works with the hog sector and whatnot. Unfortunately, he's going to be paying a lot more than $4 for corn moving forward here. I was just doing some math, and the challenging part is we got this large carryout in corn, we know that. And a lot of it will get carried into next year locally as well, just based on price and the idea and the forecasting that the price is going to go up on corn. So locally here, normally we've got a corn surplus in this area. We export a lot of corn, whether it's the domestic or the domestic feedlots to the southwest, or to the export market on the west coast. This year, we're going to be corn deficient in our area, and we're probably, and again, don't quote me on these numbers, going to have to import 8 to 12 million bushels of corn to cover our feed and ethanol needs. So now granted, we've got a pretty big draw area to pull from. So basis is, strictly the equation from supply and demand. Typically, if you have good demand, which we're going to have, and a low supply, you're going to see good basis levels, which we'll see. This summer, we're going to see positive basis levels locally. We're already seeing it some at the ethanol plants, feed mills, and that's going to, we're soon going to see at the local elevators as well, because most of them, their markets are going to be ethanol and feed driven this year as well. So we're going to see positive basis this summer. This fall, historically you have your worst basis during the fall. We could see some positive basis this fall as well. So from from a local standpoint, corn's going to be a hot commodity in our area just due to prevent acres and whatnot moving forward.
Good enough? Good enough for that answer? Any follow-up questions for that one? Good. Last year we had a presentation on hemp farming. Love to hear your thoughts on what that could do for the region in the state of Minnesota.
Well, I wasn't able to come to the meeting or whatnot, but my question is, where do we go with it? How do we handle it? And that's what I think the big challenge with hemp is right now is how do we process it, or where do we take it for processing? So I like the idea of it, and I like the things we can do with it, but I don't know how to, we can figure out a way to raise it, but what do we do once we raise it? So that I think is the challenging part as they try to grow that business.
Yeah, I think that, I think in general, that's the big thing is, okay, there's a market out there that's already developed, there's already growers, there's already processors. What do you do on top of that? I mean, you don't go to the hardware store and buy a hemp rope, you buy a nylon rope. It's not 60 years ago, but there's some great opportunity there. I think they've opened the door. I know in North Dakota, they're doing a lot of stuff, it's got to be more than bracelets at a concert than to make that industry work. So.
Anything from the financing component there, Chad?
It just kind of goes back to regulation, but they've kind of opened that up now for us, for banks to actually look at financing some of the hemp-related stuff. So it's really quite premature at this stage. Specifically, we have nothing in our policy, and we haven't made any changes to our policy. I would presume many other banks haven't. So just like the industry has to develop, all that has to develop as well. So. It just seems like it's a little ways out there.
Sure. So I have one more question. I hope that some of you have some burning questions you're ready to ask after I'm done, because we are way ahead of time, which is probably okay if you have somewhere to go. All right, this goes to anyone. There's been talk of a rural-urban divide in the areas of agriculture. How do we overcome something like that?
Well, I'll just start out. I think, when you have, some of the divides are really just made by small factions of people and groups. All the city people want to live in the country, all the country people want to live in the city, and where the borders cross, you end up having issues that you have to deal with. A lot of it goes back to, unfortunately, regulation, but locally here doesn't seem to be as big of an issue, in my opinion. We all live in the same space. We all like the same type of, like to be in South Minnesota because it is kind of agriculture per se. And so I think in general, out here, it's probably not as big of an issue as we would see in some of our metro areas of that nature.
So we hear that so when we get to the end, Chris will be able to address it quite well, I think, from the legislature, but I think attitude-wise, there is a big cultural divide between the metro area, Twin City metro area, and rural Minnesota. And rural is out here, and also northern and northwest Minnesota, the whole state. And it comes a lot when it obviously comes down to funding, when we want stuff for our infrastructure, stuff like roads, bridges, that type of thing. There's a huge, all the money is going to go for the light rail or Twin Cities roads, and not out in rural Minnesota. How we're going to overcome it, the governor talks about one state, that was one of his campaign themes. So I don't know how, maybe the first step to doing anything is at least start talking about it. And I was kind of happy that was one of his, hopefully he follows through with it, but it was good news that it was actually mentioned and acknowledged.
I think education will be key. Before we were talking about the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I just got a short story. So we had someone come out that wanted to look at our grain dryer because they were worried about the emissions. And a young person hired right out of college, and were worried about emissions and wanted to make sure that our grain dryer wasn't giving off too many emissions. So this individual came out, and we were standing right next to the elevator, right next to the grain dryer, and they asked, "Where's your grain dryer at?" Right here. So they had no idea what a grain dryer was, but they were expected to come out and tell us that our grain dryer was giving off too much emissions, too much dust, per se. So I think education is a big key, and opening those lines of communication between the rural and the metro urban life, because by default, this person had no idea what it was, but she was told, go out there and tell them they have too much dust from their dryer, but she didn't know what a grain dryer was.
I think probably the biggest issue is sometimes just perception. I think of instances where one thing is led to mean another thing, and whenever you think of a nuclear plant, what do you think of? You think of those big curved, essentially they're air coolers and the big steam coming out of it, and all that is steam. Yet most people would say, oh, that's probably just bad stuff coming out of there, and all it is water. And I think agriculture, to some extent, to some groups in the state of Minnesota, and rural Minnesota in general, small cities, towns, whatever, have become a boogeyman to some folks. Like, your water's being poisoned, your food's being poisoned, and you're going to die unless we change this or regulate this. And I think we saw that locally in Marshall. Kind of a little synopsis was, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, they had that coyote hunt, where they were going to do some coyote hunting, I think out of Brow Brothers Brewery, and it got national attention. They had 500,000 or 100,000 people sign a petition saying, calling the mayor, calling city councilmen, saying stop that hunt. The hunt went on, but some environmental group probably made $3 or $4 million fundraising off of it. And so, oftentimes that coyote hunt is agriculture. That coyote hunt is a confinement barn. That coyote hunt is 20 or 30 different things that we're doing here in rural Minnesota. Cutting our ditches along the state highways. That is somebody's boogeyman, and they're going to fundraise or they're going to win politics in a suburban seat because of it. So essentially that's what politics is not the race in Minneapolis. It's not necessarily the race in southwest Minnesota, but it's the race, the political race, and the mindset of water quality, whatever that might be, food, being poisoned, and education in a suburban swing district. And so, when you think about you think about national politics, oftentimes you think, why do we have Medicare Part D for senior citizens? Because there's probably 3 or 4 counties that have polled really well in Florida. And so, why do you have a certain regulation is because, well, when we poll the suburban district someplace in the state, that particular issue or that particular regulation polled really well for suburban moms between the ages of 35 and 45. And so oftentimes the politics of policy, the politics side simply outweighs, the ramifications of it. And that's because, if you're in the minority, your policy position really doesn't matter that much. And so I think that's one of the unique things we have in Minnesota is that we have a split legislature. We have a governor that's a Democrat, House that's Democrat, and a Senate that's Republican. And so I didn't come here to be political, but I think that's when we're thinking about policy and agriculture and that rural-urban divide, oftentimes that's those things that we don't necessarily see here in rural Minnesota because we don't see these ad campaigns, we don't see people coming to our doors, knocking on, doing all this different stuff, and those types of things can kind of drive it. You see that in, what are grocery stores doing? We just heard that Aldi, which is a new retailer here in Marshall, is moving everything to organic and, free range or whatever. I'm not sure what all they're doing, but, so why are they doing that? Well, the market is asking them to do it. There is, push polls at that business from a capitalistic standpoint saying, right, any capitalist with half a brain says, well, what do people buy? What do they want to buy? What do they think is going to kill them? And then you don't do that. And so, I think that's a part of it, believe it or not. And so as people get further and further away from the farm, Greg spoke to it a little bit when we talked about the new employees coming into the NPCA. The only time they saw a farm was when they were flying to Cancun on vacation. That's from 30,000 feet, and they're the ones going to tell you how to do business. And I think that's a problem. I think, Farm Bureau does a really good job at the Capitol. They do an adoptive legislator program where they adopt an urban legislator who probably has never seen a farm or been on a farm or been to a hog barn. Things like Greg did just a week or two ago when they opened up some of their facilities to let folks see what it's like, what does a building do, and I think that's what we each need to do as folks in agribusiness or farmers as well, or folks from higher education. Southwest State's doing an excellent job of expanding their agricultural programs, being regionally significant so that at least we can tell our story here regionally. Because if you don't create ambassadors, which essentially are folks that graduate from your university's higher education, they can go tell the story of agriculture. They can go to that small business in Edina or Maple Grove and say, well, agriculture really isn't that. This is really what it is. And we're not just dumping manure in ditches. We're not just doing all these things. We're really trying to be wise with our dollars because at the end of the day, we got to be competitive internationally and we got to do our jobs as best we can because we're not just competing against Brookings, South Dakota. We're fighting against Taiwan and the Chinese and the rest for markets and the rest, and finding financing. So I think that's a big story. That's a kind of an interesting question, but at the end of the day, we just have to be able to tell our story to folks that maybe have never seen a farm.
Any follow-up questions on that? Any other questions in general? You kind of touched on the workforce.
Good question, Greg. I've heard similar. This question would be for Greg. I've heard similar numbers in terms of 50% of the Chinese sow population is just gone, which equates to approximately 25% of the world pig population. What do you think? If we assume that overall worldwide meat demand is going to remain consistent or grow slightly, what do you think is going to fill that 25% gap? Is it going to be pork? Is it going to be another meat product? And I guess the second portion of that would be I know it's more beef-based, what you hear in the news with the plant-based protein, as a direct competitor to beef, but I guess just any comments with your experience in the pig business. I don't know if any of that's carried over into that. You mostly hear it with beef, but just any comments you'd have regarding that.
Yeah, there's a couple aspects of that. So first, I think in China, 50% of the pigs are gone. Just to clarify that too, 50% didn't die from the disease. a lot of them, as that disease was just spreading across the country, not in check at all. So if you're a producer 20 miles away or 50 miles away or whatever distance, and you just saw your neighbor's herd decimated from it, they loaded up their whole farm and just sent them all to market. That's why when the prices skyrocketed in the winter, then the realization was China had a glut of pork because they were shipping, everybody was shipping their pigs to market trying to get ahead of it. So that was just not related to your question, but something I thought about afterwards. I think in China the protein, they aren't rebuilding. They've attempted to refill some of their barns and their farms with pigs after they've cleaned up from the disease, and they've had almost no success. Almost every herd has rebroke with the disease. That's where some of those barns are now being filled with poultry. So what I'm hearing and told in China, particularly, their culture revolves around eating pork. So they're going to eat all the pork of their own that they have. They're going to buy all that they can afford. Then they'll shift over to poultry. And I think that's a market that I don't like to see as far as being a pork producer. I think it's a market we'll lose permanently is to poultry as they acquire a new taste for poultry. So that I think will happen there. As far as where their pork will come from, right now it's coming from Europe, Brazil, Chile primarily because of our tariffs, and they've got a real conflict with Canada. A political deal that's kind of interesting. So I think if we could open up our trade with China. In China, they view things in terms of centuries. We want instant gratification here, so I think it'll be a slow process to enter that market, even when the tariffs are gone. And then you also mentioned this fake meat deal. We've talked about that a lot in the last month at a couple of the meetings I've been at. It impacts ground beef more than, and beef will never make an impact in China because it's too expensive. Contrary to what, they're pretty China's economy is growing, but they still aren't a rich people, and they're in a recession themselves right now. So I don't think beef is going to make a big inroad there. That fake meat, some of it's vegetable based, some of it is protein based that they grow in a petri dish. I think that might become. We were talking about it at a couple weeks ago at a meeting. So one of the guys ordered a couple of the burgers to pass around for us to all taste. If you put enough ketchup and mayonnaise and stuff, you can make it get by. I think it'll become a niche market for a certain part of the population. The irony is they might look at it as like what we would view organic, or we would view pasture raised, as being more wholesome, more healthy. And then when you see the list of ingredients in it and all the processes and processing that goes into making it, it's the furthest thing from the concept of organic or a backyard, or of all the perceptions that we have of a niche market. So I'm kind of concerned about it, but not as alarmed as maybe some people.
One last question. Anyone?
My name is Paul Swedzinski. I work with the Land Stewardship Project and also farm down by Mobasso. I raise livestock, raise pigs, and certainly understand some of the pieces brought up today about what the pressure is on whatever kind of farmer you are. I understand from raising hogs for Diamond Ranch that any of our operations could be impacted by the swine fever issue. And we certainly all want to keep that out. And I believe looking at how we keep markets open is important. But one of the pieces that's raising concern from many of our members is what we call, and I think Colin Peterson has now done a public piece on saying the impending farm crisis and worried about agriculture. And I know that today we talked about being some disconnect between those who farm and those who are otherwise who don't. And yet we're under this pressure similar to almost like the mid-1980s, in which it appears more people are going to be forced off the farm. And so I'm wondering from a banking standpoint how you're looking at it in terms of the loans, but also I think from a community standpoint, how are people looking at how are we going to push back and keep farmers out here, you know, in terms of improving income, in terms of improving price? Now, I know that's a lot to dissect there, but I think just like in the 80s, a lot of us worked together. We formed Groundswell, we pushed back, got some things at the state level, got some things at the federal level. It seems to me like we're there again. So turn it over to you, Chad, and let you say from a banking perspective, and glad to hear from the rest of the panel. Thank you.
So we get that question a ton of, or, you know, we're heading back through the 80s, and of course, someone like myself, I was around in the 80s, but I wasn't paying attention to anything but cartoons and things of that nature. But there's certainly a ton of parallels to that today, and yet there's many differences to it. You know, I'll let everybody kind of answer, but a couple things that I would just point out, you know, from the banking side, one of the big things that's different from a portfolio type is the crop insurance program and the way that has turned out. So it's specific to crop producers, which, you know, many farm operations at least have a component of crop production in there. The crop insurance piece has provided some sort of safety net that wasn't as well established back in the 80s. So that was problematic as well. As far as specific to banking, some of that comes down to the banks themselves and how they're built and the diversification within their portfolio. So we certainly have lots of finance companies or banks that are primarily ag, and that can create a lot of undue stress for not only their own portfolios, but also those that are being financed by them. Not to speak specifically at Bremer, but you know, we're one of the larger banks in the United States. I believe we're the last rankings just on banks, so we're not including like AgStar and things of that nature. But we're the 11th largest bank, 11th largest ag bank in the United States, and yet ag's only about 15% of our portfolio. That being said, we have, you know, other areas of our portfolio that are very much supported by the ag sector. We operate in a lot of small communities like Marshall, and we end up having, you know, it's just a trickle-down effect, as we all know. And so for us, if we were to go to a situation that we were in the 80s, high interest rates, farm values falling, things of that nature, that would put a lot of strain on our bank, but it wouldn't put, but we could handle it because of that diversification. But there's certainly other banks who are diversified different that could create maybe too much strain and whatnot. So kind of to wrap it all up from the banking perspective, the other piece, as I mentioned this earlier, is just the way we're regulated. We used to be able to kind of keep more cash in reserves. It was kind of like a prepayment per se of bad debt that was going to come down the road sometime in the future. That with bank regulation, that kind of went by the wayside maybe 15 years ago or something like that. So we can't just have this prepaid expense tucked in the corner. We certainly have a provision. All banks do. It's part of your strength, but there's less of regulation on how much you can keep in there. There came a point where I believe the IRS said, hey, that's enough. We'd like to get some taxes paid on some of that money, because it really was just a prepaid expense that sat in a different category. So as provisions got, shall we say, regulated a little bit, the ability to hold problem debt for a longer period of time now potentially could be an issue that would creep up on us faster than it would have in the 80s potentially.
So, you mentioned Colin Peterson, so when he's doing his town hall meeting in Marshall, a big topic and a big theme and a straight up warning from him is that we were on the forefront of a farm crisis similar to the 1980s. I had the opportunity last Wednesday, I was in Colin Peterson's office in Washington, D.C. His attitude has improved, would be my word, but it is different now than it was even 2 months ago. And he acknowledged, it takes a disaster to create an opportunity. The disastrous crop that we have out there has increased the prices for the corn, for sure, not soybeans yet so much, but so that's kind of helped. And then the safety net of the crop insurance program, so that for the people that are getting a disastrous crop, they'll have the safety net of crop insurance. And then for the people that are in the areas that are having a normal or average crop coming, the prices have improved dramatically. So he's not quite as pessimistic things as he was a month or two ago, which is good news. And then the other part about that, unlike these two guys who were watching cartoons, and my wife and I, we were living through the 80s, living all those trials and turmoils, and for anyone that was too young, it is one of those lifelong experiences that you refer back to forever. And so from the pork industry, such as I am here again, the ASF, if you take away 25% of the exports, drive the prices down to, not zero, but down dramatically, that's gonna, the trickle down effect from that in empty barns, empty, feed not being used. So there's a lot of factors that are going into it, and hopefully it doesn't materialize, but it is a realistic, it's a real concern. But I think possibly with a short crop, and the great the crop insurance program that we have, we may head it off.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Due to crop insurance now, and Chad alluded to it in the very first question, some of these guys who went prevent are going to turn out pretty well because of the insurance aspect. And the market has provided opportunities to sell grain at a profitable level. Those producers that are diversified, I think they're going to be better off through this period. One of the big things I'm concerned with is, we talked about the average age of the farmer being 55, and typically when you see some sort of a farm crisis or things become difficult, you see large consolidation, and I think we'll see that as that older generation of farmer just retires, and realistically there's very poor succession planning going on in the farming industry right now, and just due to that we'll see consolidation. And as somebody who works with producers, that's concerning for us. It should be concerning to local businesses as well, because as we consolidate, those larger farmers will become more pricey, and they'll be harder to work with. So something we're doing right now is working really doing a big customer segmentation piece, where we're segmenting our customers into quadrants that people we can do business with, or people that are going to be more difficult to do business with, and building relationships and rapport with them. So that's what I think will be challenging moving forward as we come through this what could be a difficult time and age, is seeing this older generation of farmers retire, and what's the next generation look like.
Sure. I think there's a lot of good points made. I think one of the, when I talked to my dad, this was before my time, I was probably watching cartoons too, in the 1980s, but he talked a lot about 13, 14, 18% interest rates, and what that does to an operation, what that does to a piece of land or a piece of equipment, and its costs and its maintenance. I think, if you look at, I think the Fed chairman back then was Paul Volcker, and they essentially, there was about 13% during the 1970s, under the previous administration, there was, I think, 13% more money created. In order to pull that money back out of the market, they had to create interest rates of 18% in order to pull that money back to stop inflation and stop kind of that runaway inflationary process that was going in the country. And obviously there's a lot of farmers that bought property at the exact wrong time, $1,800 or $2,000, it's never gonna go down. Well, 4 years ago I heard that too, it's $10,000 or $6,000, it's never gonna go down. Well, it can. And what that does to your portfolio, what that does to your cash value as an operation, that has not changed. Instead of 13% more money, we've got 100% more cash creation in the last 10 years. So how that affects the market long-term, I mean, that's a long-term issue. The short-term issue is, access to land, access to capital, access to that next generation of farm. I mean, every single farm auction you see, more than likely, is a farm that's no longer in the family. So every auction that you see, the John Deere tractor, the International Combine, is probably an operation that is closing up. The kids don't want to come home. They might live locally, but they're not interested in the risk, because guess what, there is. And there's hair loss because of it. And in this day and Facebook age, we don't really want the hair loss, but then we don't necessarily want the stress when we can go to town and not necessarily have it. So, we've seen it, folks getting outbid on land, whether it be from state-sponsored organizations or just larger operations. A lot of folks are retiring. So, healthcare is a big issue too. Healthcare costs as an individual business owner, it's a big, big issue. When you're spending $1,500 or $2,000 for a premium as an independent operator farmer, that's a huge expense that is growing. The cost of healthcare is not getting smaller. There's a lot of plans out there. I wish I had a magic wand that could create that issue, but at the fundamental, people are living longer. It costs a lot to keep them healthy. So healthcare and the rest, and finance, those are all big issues that are be making the decision when people are staying on the farm. So I think it's past 1 o'clock, and I'll be quiet. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys. And it's time to wrap up the meeting when one of our panelists' wives has to take off. So that's not a good time to get down. So again, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, and give a nice round of applause for. Thanks again to our sponsors, and thanks for all of you that come, and have a nice rest of the day.